A farmer named Shanun Rammel got word from a neighbor that grizzly tracks had turned up near his land east of Choteau, Montana, flat farm country, an hour out onto the prairie from the nearest mountains. He drove out to check a pond, and on the way decided to look in on an abandoned barn to make sure no one had left grain inside that might draw an animal in. He pulled the door open. The grizzly that had been sheltering in the dark of that barn came out the only way it could, straight through him. It mauled him on its way past and was gone. His wife, Jamie, said it happened so fast that a gun would not have helped. As fast as that bear came out and got my husband, he couldn't have gotten to a gun even if he'd had one. There was not supposed to be a grizzly in that barn. There was not supposed to be a grizzly within 50 miles of that barn. This was wheat and cattle country, the open high plains, a place where no living person remembered the Great Bear. And yet there it was, in a farmer's outbuilding, doing what grizzlies have apparently started doing again all across this part of Montana, turning up where the map says they ended 100 years ago. It would mean less if it were the only one. It is part of a pattern that has been building for years. In the small farm towns where the Montana mountains give way to prairie, Augusta, Choteau, Valier, Belt, residents are adjusting to something their grandparents never had to think about: grizzlies in the cattle pastures in broad daylight, grizzlies shaking the doors of grain silos to make the feed spill out, grizzlies in the chicken coops, after the grain, not the chickens. One family 3 miles outside Belt assumed a mountain lion had killed their pig, until they set a game camera on the carcass and a grizzly walked back into frame. Bears have been confirmed as far as 175 miles east of the mountains. Wildlife officials estimate 70 to 80 of them are now living out on the high plains, and they are not being trucked in or released. They are walking out there on their own. This is the space the whole story lives in. State biologists confirm the bears are coming, but cannot say how far the return will go, or how a landscape of farms and highways and nervous ranchers will absorb an 800-pound predator that was deliberately erased from it. The bears keep appearing where they are not expected. Each one is treated as a stray, an outlier, a problem to be managed, right up until the next one shows up 40 miles past where the last one did. It is not yet a prairie full of grizzlies. It is no longer a prairie without them, and the reason it is happening starts with a fact that almost everyone has backwards. The grizzly bear, Ursus arctos horribilis, the silver-tipped 800-pound tank that most Americans picture as the king of Yellowstone and Glacier, ruling the high mountain wilderness, is not a mountain animal. It never was. The grizzly is a brown bear, the same species that ranges the open steppes of Russia and Central Asia, and it is built for open country. In North America, its kingdom was the grasslands, the river bottoms, and the badlands, as much as the peaks. The image of the grizzly as a creature of the high country is a modern accident, a story we tell because the mountains are the only place the survivors were left. Before 1800, as many as 50,000 grizzlies ranged the western half of the continent, and the Great Plains were squarely part of their dominion. The proof is in the most famous journey in American history. When Lewis and Clark pushed up the Missouri River in 1805, they met the grizzly out on the open plains at no fewer than 17 separate locations on the way up, the first of them near what is now Fort Peck Reservoir in eastern Montana, some of them as far east as the Montana-North Dakota line. Of the roughly 40 grizzlies the expedition killed, the great majority were taken in Montana on the prairie. The bears terrified them. Lewis called the grizzly a most tremendous-looking animal and extremely hard to kill. One 600-pound male took 10 rifle balls before it dropped. And the maulings, the legends remember, happened on the flatlands, not the peaks. Hugh Glass, the frontiersman whose ordeal became the Revenant, was savaged by a grizzly on the open prairie of northwestern South Dakota. The Plains tribes lived alongside these bears from the Dakotas down to Kansas. The Mississippi River was the eastern edge of their world. There is a detail worth keeping honest here, because the old maps overstate it. The prairie grizzlies were not spread evenly across the whole shortgrass sea. They concentrated along the rivers and the creek bottoms and the brushy draws, where the choke cherries and buffalo berries grew and where the carcasses of drowned bison piled up. They were animals of the water and the edges, threading the open country along its green seams. But along those seams, across the entire northern Great Plains, The grizzly was at home for thousands of years. What happened to them is not what the school books imply. The grizzly did not retreat into the mountains for sanctuary. The plains bears were simply killed, shot, trapped, and poisoned out of existence as settlers turned the buffalo steppe into grain fields and cattle range. The bears that happened to live in the remote high country survived because the high country was hard to reach. That is the only reason we think of the grizzly as a mountain animal at all. By the 1950s, the grizzlies of Montana had been squeezed down to Glacier National Park, the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and the core of the Yellowstone ecosystem. In 1975, with perhaps 250 left in the northern Rockies, the grizzly was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And then, slowly, over half a century of protection, it came back. The population centered on the northern continental divide, the Glacier and Bob Marshall country, has climbed to around 1,000 bears. There are now somewhere between 1,400 and 1,700 grizzlies in the lower 48. And a recovered predator population does the one thing populations always do. It runs out of room, and it pushes outward, in this case, back down out of the mountains, toward the open country it was driven from. The evidence that this is a real return, and not just a few lost bears, is in what the bears are now doing once they get there. They have reached 175 miles east of the mountains to the country around Loma, Montana. They have crossed more than 100 miles of farm country from the Rocky Mountain front to the Missouri River, and did it without anyone noticing, an 800-pound animal moving through settled land completely undetected until it chose to be seen. A landowner on the Judith River photographed a grizzly on a game camera, the first confirmed on that stretch of prairie in over a decade. And the part that matters most, the bears out there are not all wandering young males passing through. Montana's grizzly bear management specialist has watched adult females teaching their cubs to use the prairie. It's a biological fact, he said. Bears are digging their winter dens far out east of the mountains, on the plains. When females den and raise their young on the prairie is no longer a place grizzlies pass through. It is a place grizzlies live. Which raises the obvious question the Rammels never thought to ask until a bear came out of their barn. How does an animal that size move through open farm country without anyone seeing it? The answer is that it doesn't cross the open prairie in daylight. It moves at night, and it follows the water, the cottonwood bottoms along the rivers, the brushy creeks, the shelter belts planted between the fields. The same green seams its ancestors used for thousands of years still run through this country, and a grizzly can thread them in the dark, bed down in the brush by day, and raise cubs in the trees along a creek 2 miles from a farmhouse whose owners have no idea it is there. The bears were not announcing themselves. They were doing what grizzlies have always done on the plains, living in the river bottoms, where almost no one ever looks. The skeptic's objection here is not whether the bears are real. They plainly are. It is whether this is a genuine return or just a handful of problem animals that will be shot or relocated until the prairie is quiet again. And the answer comes in pieces. The 70 to 80 figure is not a census, it is a floor. The prairie river bottoms are private, vast, and unwatched, and a bear that stays in the cottonwoods and travels at night leaves almost no trace, so the real number is certainly higher than the one anyone can confirm. The just strays theory does not survive contact with the females teaching cubs and the dens dug on the plains. The frontier is breeding, which is the opposite of a stray. And the true obstacle to the grizzlies' return was never the prairie itself, which can feed them fine. It is us. The interstate highways the bears have to cross, and the ranchers and farmers, understandably, who do not want an apex predator in the calving pasture. The plains can hold grizzlies. The open question is whether the people on them will. Honesty requires saying plainly what this is not. This is not a prairie overrun with grizzlies. It is a thin, advancing edge, perhaps 70 or 80 bears at the margin of farm country, most of them never straying far from the river bottoms near the mountains. And the bears are not, for the most part, coming for the cattle. The state's own specialist puts it bluntly, grizzlies are not effective carnivores. They are coming for grain, for choke cherries and buffalo berries, for carrion, for the spilled feed in an outbuilding, which is exactly what likely drew the bear into the Rammel's barn in the first place. The occasional livestock killer is real. A single female near Valier killed 40 sheep in one weekend before federal officials shot her. But she was the exception, not the rule. And the romantic picture of grizzlies, once blanketing the entire Great Plains, is overdrawn. They were creatures of the river corridors and the northern plains, not an even carpet of bears from Montana to Texas. The real story does not need the exaggerations, because the real story is stranger than the myth. The science does not claim the grizzly has retaken the Great Plains. It claims something more precise, that the animal everyone pictures as the Lord of the Mountains was never truly a mountain animal at all. It was a creature of the open country and the river bottoms, exterminated from the prairie within the span of 2 or 3 human lifetimes, and now entirely on its own, walking back out of the high country it was cornered in, denning and raising cubs on the plains for the first time in 100 years. No one released these bears. No one planned this. A protected population simply filled up its mountains and began spilling back down into the grasslands that were always part of its home, while the people who farmed that country, who believed the prairie was theirs alone to work, learned that they are sharing it again with the animal it was taken from. So it ends where it began, at a barn door east of Choteau. The bear inside was not lost, and it was not an invader. It was a plains animal in plains country, doing what its kind did along these rivers for thousands of years before anyone decided the prairie was for wheat and cattle and nothing with claws. It came back the way they are all coming back, quietly, at night, up the cottonwood bottoms, into the grain. And the only thing that had truly changed was that no one out there was expecting it anymore. Past the last row of mountains, in the brush along the creeks, in the dark beyond the farmyard light, the great bear is shuffling back onto the prairie it never wanted to leave. And the people of the high plains are learning all over again what it means to live in grizzly country.